Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining. We'll give just one more minute for attendees to join the call, and then we'll get started on today's webcast. Folks who are just joining, welcome. We're just giving a moment for everybody to get into the call before we get started with today's presentation. So thanks so much. All right, I think we'll get a few more folks, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks to everybody who's here for the session. Welcome to today's webinar. The EU CRA clock is ticking. Are you compliant? My name is Chase Snyder. I'm the host and the moderator of today's webinar. I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get into the main content. So we are recording today's session. Everybody will get both a copy of the slides and a link to the recording in a follow-up email, as well as any other assets or links that we happen to mention during the discussion. We will also take Q&A during the session, so feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box. We'll either take them during the session if they make sense with the current section, or we'll save them for a relevant section, or keep a few minutes at the end for any last questions. We are able to provide a certificate of attendance if you want to submit that for continuing education credits. We don't directly provide the credits, but we can give you the certificate to submit to the folks who you would submit those to for your credits. And without further ado, I'm going to get us started and introduce myself and other speakers. So, like I said, I'm Chase Snyder. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Eclipsium. And with me is the esteemed Brian Dunphy, Vice President of Product here, and a multi-decade veteran of the cybersecurity space with a lot of relevant experience to talk about the EU Cyber Resilience Act and the relevant, the topics at hand. So, Brian, you want to say a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll dive into the content?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the intro, Chase. So Brian Dunphy, VP of Product here at Eclipsium. Uh, Over 25 years of experience. I've spent my entire career in some combination of protecting enterprises directly or building software to enable companies to protect themselves. So I have a great background that I can provide some additional insights here on CRA to ultimately help each of you better protect and better be ready for CRA.
Yes. Thank you so much, Brian. Awesome. Yeah, let's dive right in. So, starting out, we'll give a little bit of background. If you're on this webcast, probably you already know a lot about CRA. And so we're not going to go give a whole summary of everything that it is, but just to set the baseline of what exactly it is and what we're talking about it and why we particularly at Eclipsium are interested and are having more and more conversations with our customers and prospects about this regulation. Fundamentally, the problems that CRA is trying to solve are, and some of this is directly quoted from the EU CRA materials, that hardware and software products are increasingly the target of successful cyber attacks costing trillions of euros. So these products frequently have a low level of cybersecurity, a lot of vulnerabilities, and insufficient or inconsistent security updates. And users don't have the understanding or the access to information to help them choose products with adequate cybersecurity. And when we say users, that has a little bit of an implication of maybe like end users or consumers, but it also applies to enterprises and organizations that buy technology with digital elements, which is a really key phrase in CRA, that comes with hardware and components inside of it that are have vulnerabilities in it that they don't have great visibility into or knowledge about, and therefore not only cannot effectively choose secure products, but also don't know whether the products they already have deployed, the foundation of their business, are secure or not. So these are, yeah, genuine serious problems that the CRA is an attempt at solving through regulation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of it and then get into some specific perspectives and gaps that we at Eclipsium have identified that we think are requirements in the Cyber Resilience Act that are going to be difficult or are not already part of the sort of standard practices or muscle memory of many organizations. There are some requirements in here that we think a lot of manufacturers and buyers of technology may not already have the tools or the processes or the expertise to easily solve. We're going to talk about what you can hopefully do about them. So
Actually, before we move on, Chase,
yeah,
just a couple pieces to add to that. I guess first off, from a CRA, it's you use the word attempt, like, and only time will tell an attempt, right? I mean,
sure
it's easy
does.
to write things. It's another thing to get adoption. Look, the reality is like CRA has all the potential to have like widespread impact in the industry, just like PCI, just like GDPR, just like HIPAA has had across the environment. So yeah, only time will tell on how that, but it does have that potential to really raise the bar on security. Now, like if I think about the broader problem, like imagine, well, maybe, some of you guys may not have to imagine because this may be exactly your job. Like ultimately, you have to protect your enterprise from attacks, and you're probably buying solutions from hundreds, if not thousands, of different vendors on any given day. And the brutal reality is that each vendor may be more or less mature and providing you a secure product. Um, and so that's just the brutal reality of today. And so as an enterprise, you're going to be left sort of holding the bag and like I got to protect this enterprise, and I have whether it's a IoT camera or a new a computer from your favorite manufacturer, like they all have these inherent vulnerabilities and inherent risk, and it's very difficult for you to understand what that risk is when you bring that component, that solution to your enterprise. And so it puts you in a really bad spot. It doesn't set you up for success to be able to make good decisions on how to protect your enterprise. And the net result, our enterprises are frequently not just attacked, but compromised. Um, CRA is really intending to shift the burden, not shift it completely, but it's really intending to put manufacturers on notice that they need to do more. They need to and we'll walk through some of the specific requirements that are shifting to the manufacturer, but ultimately they're trying to shift the burden to manufacturers to set enterprises up for success, to ship solutions that are more secure and more resilient to attacks. So enterprises can be as a combination of all these products running in their environment, ultimately be more secure. And so that at a very high level is really the intended outcome is to help put enterprises in a position where they can protect themselves, which is not really necessarily the case today. So like, again, I think this really has widespread impact, not just to enterprises in a positive way, but also to manufacturers in a like do better to provide more secure solutions. So with that, Chase, I will let's get into the details about what that actually means.
Yeah, 100%. Getting security upstream benefits
That's right.
everybody. So yeah, talking about the scope, what is in scope for EUCRA, and how deep it goes, and it goes deep. So the type of products that we talk about a lot in the context of enterprise technology, servers, switches, firewalls, application delivery controllers, laptops, consumer technology too, but enterprise technology, and then down into the components and chips inside of those. So baseboard management controllers, uh, network interface cards, DPUs, storage, IoT and industrial devices, industrial control systems, all of that stuff is subject to CRA, and also the firmware and the code that runs on those things that is often buried quite deeply inside of the device and not something that a lot of enterprises are used to examining or vetting for its security. And also, it's something that has a long and complicated supply chain where whoever you get your hardware, your devices from, they may or may not have created or modified the chips or the firmware, and even who they got their components from. It may have come with stock firmware. There could be several layers of manufacturers that either created or modified that stuff along the way. And by the time it gets to the end user, your ability to know what's actually in there and whether it's secure is pretty limited, and CRA is kind of trying to address that.
Yeah, and I actually I love the uh, the way that the CRA is written in this particular way place, uh, it's so easy to think about digital assets as software only. And the reality is that a lot of solutions are really the combination of software and hardware. Um, and like I even if I look back at like products I've managed 5, 10 years ago, like I was focused on the software, and some of those solutions did ship with hardware from suppliers that I contracted with. But my focus was on the software. That is no longer good enough. You ultimately having the especially as a manufacturer owning the entire solution, the software, the hardware, the individual components that make up is it provides that complete solution and resiliency for the complete solution, and B, I think it also clearly recognizes that it's not just software being attacked anymore. It's often the hardware and or the firmware that allows that hardware to talk to the software. It's ultimately those each of those layers are being attacked. Each of those add additional risk to enterprises, and I think CRA really reflects that well to provide focus not just at the software layer, but sort of all elements of that solution.
100%. 100% agree. So manufacturers are the primary target or audience, I guess. They have the most responsibilities under CRA. There's a couple of other, importers and distributors also have responsibilities, but really it's device manufacturers or anybody who's making a product that contains digital elements that will be brought to market in the EU. And that, while this is an EU regulation, similarly to GDPR coming up on like 10 years ago now, this is going to have global implications. If you are making devices or bringing anything with digital elements, which can include hardware and firmware and software into market in the EU, this is going to affect you. So I think the global impact of this is going to be meaningful. And yeah, there's sort of these six summary kind of core obligations that manufacturers have. One is that they have to ship devices, ship their products with no known exploitable vulnerabilities, no universal default passwords, and a minimal attack surface. And that's, to me, those things sound like things that would be best practice already, but we know from often painful experience that it's not. There, the number of cyber attacks that are disclosed that depended entirely on a default password, an admin username, admin password in a device, it's huge. And devices shipping with known vulnerabilities, whether they're known exploitable or not yet, I think that manufacturers are, in many cases, doing their best or making a good faith effort. Um, and it's just very difficult to do that, to ship devices with no vulnerabilities. But also, if you ship vulnerable devices, those risks trickle downstream and become very widespread. And as Brian was saying before, bringing the responsibility back to the source and having manufacturers ship things that at least aren't vulnerable when they're shipped is a really important, it's a high leverage thing to do to reduce overall global cyber risk. Yeah, manufacturers also have to provide an SBOM, so they have to tell you what's inside the device, which you would think would be kind of a standard operating procedure, but a lot don't do that by default or even can't do it upon request that will now have to do it. Assessing conformity essentially means assessing your product and being able to say in good faith, yes, this conforms with the requirements of CRA, so you can get that CE sticker on the box or on the device, essentially. And then shipping security updates, giving free security updates for 5 years. We could have a whole other session about devices that go end of life or end of support, but are still deployed in like mission critical situations. But manufacturers are going to be required to ship security updates, also required to report vulnerabilities. They'll have to notify the national CSIRT within 24 hours, and we'll get into the other sort of parts of that timeline later, and publish a disclosure policy so that it is published and known and can be held accountable for what their policy is on disclosing vulnerabilities in their products.
And so, Chase, you said this earlier, but I'm a double down on it. Like, I can't say there's anything on here that manufacturers shouldn't have been doing already. Like
Yeah,
best practices, these are best practice. These have been best practice for years. But the key here is prior to CRA, uh, this slide title would have read what manufacturers should do. Uh, Post CRA, that should becomes must. Like there's now a legal requirement to do these things. And so I think that's really the key shift here is look for the manufacturers that have been doing the right thing all along. Like CRA doesn't inject a lot of change because they probably are doing these things already. The reality is that a lot of manufacturers weren't. And that's what CRA is intended to change and really establish sort of a bar of what's acceptable if you're going to be shipping products into enterprises, or not just enterprises, but ultimately if you're going to be shipping products, so you don't introduce risk to enterprises, consumers, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to throw in a little plug here. I would love to know from people who are in the audience whether you are here with an interest in this topic as a manufacturer and you're wondering what do I have to do or what the aspects are that drew you to join us and learn more about this topic right now, or if you're more on the buyer or consumer side, not consumer as a buyer of a phone or whatever, but an enterprise buyer of technology, what are the big concerns that you have, and are these obligations things that your organization is having to face or struggling with? I'd be very curious to know. Also open to just any other sort of questions. So throw them in the Q&A. We love having a conversation with the audience during these things. Um, yeah, for that should to must part of the conversation, it's like the big way, the big, carrot and stick situation here is that there are serious financial penalties for noncompliance. And this is another realm where we can compare to GDPR, where GDPR, I looked it up and it sounds like there's been about 7 billion euros worth of fines levied on the basis of GDPR violations. Not all of those have actually been paid, but many of them are in this appeals process, which presumably is consuming a lot of expensive lawyer time and other resources that organizations better could be better spent on building better products or building more secure products. So it'll be very interesting to see once these deadlines land what enforcement looks like, whether organizations see these amounts as a meaningful incentive for them to change how they operate to comply with this, versus just eating the fines or appealing them, or sort of there's a lot of ways that this could shake out, but the the numbers could be potentially kind of staggering, like 2.5% of worldwide turnover at the high end for a company that's doing billions and billions of dollars or euros in business is a meaningful amount of money potentially. So this thing has teeth and will likely affect larger and smaller enterprises in different ways. But very interested to see how enforcement shakes out and how it changes the behavior of manufacturers. The timeline for those deadlines. So September 11, 2026 is when the 24-hour notification deadline. We'll talk a little bit more about those deadlines. There's been a couple of recent deadlines, a couple of upcoming deadlines, which is part of why CRA is coming up more and more in conversation with internally at Eclipsium and within our customers and prospects, is that these deadlines are arriving. Likely, folks have been aware of this and working on it for a long time, and it's possible that they're running into the sort of last little nuts and bolts and challenging parts of it, and finding like, oh, there's still some parts of this that we need to get shored up before these deadlines hit. So yeah, June 26th, the surveillance bodies were designated. September, so coming up in just like a week and a half or 2 weeks from this recording, there will be the deadline for the 24-hour vulnerability notification, exploited vulnerability notification, and in December of 2027, the act will be fully in effect, fully enforced. And then we've got the 5-year timeline for free security updates. That's just an ongoing requirement for manufacturers to provide security updates to their products. And three challenges, we keep talking about these specific challenges manufacturers and distributors are going to face. So there is a self-declaration allowance essentially where you don't have to have a third party inspect your device, but as we talked about, the frequency with which it is disclosed that a device that has been out in the market for a while, turned out to have a bunch of vulnerabilities in it already, indicates that I feel that self-certification has a little bit of risk associated with it because if you self-certify and then it turns out that you were wrong about that, I'm not really sure how the penalties will shake out for that. But we essentially are in the business of believing and helping folks get third-party visibility into devices and technology that is typically kind of a black box to them. And we really think that it's important to not just have that blind trust of a vendor, but to be able to verify yourself as a buyer of technology that you got what you expected. So self-certification is kind of already the model in that if you just trust a vendor that they're shipping something that is secure to you, you're essentially accepting a self-certification. This obviously has different implications because of the regulation. They can now be punished or fined for having a faulty self-certification. The reporting ecosystem, when you have a 24-hour deadline, you got to have a system in place to be able to meet that. You got to have a contact already. You got to be like ready to pull the trigger on that notification because 24 hours is pretty short, even to give just an early warning that there's a known exploited vulnerability in your product. Uh, we've seen much longer timelines play out and later be disclosed from when something was discovered to when it was disclosed. So this meaningfully accelerates disclosure in some situations. And then the substantial modification challenge is that the responsibility for maintaining compliance or conformity to CRA can move downstream if you modify components or software and firmware in your products, which many organizations do. Particularly, we look a lot at network devices, network infrastructure. Those typically have they'll often have like some flavor of Linux as the underlying operating system, but that's been customized and modified. And that means that those organizations that did that customization become responsible for the conformity for the CRA compliance of those devices. So these are some areas where we feel that folks are potentially going to face challenges that are only going to come out reality sets in as these deadlines start to sort of hit. So talking about the timelines for disclosure, the 24 hours is specifically just an early warning. So yeah, 24 hours would be a really fast timeline to really understand the nature of a known exploited vulnerability. But when you find out that a product that you brought to market has an exploited vulnerability, you have to notify the CSIRT within 24 hours, provide a detailed notification. Um, and I'm sure there's sort of a range or a spectrum of what level of detail needs to be included in that within 72 hours, and then a final report within 14 days. That alone could really consume, that could take up an entire team's whole 2 weeks to do that in many of these cases where you're having to investigate and understand and provide details on an exploited vulnerability that is discovered in one of your products. So I think we're likely to see some organizations run into just a bandwidth issue or capacity issue in trying to meet these reporting deadlines. Uh, I'm very curious to see as the first sort of notifications and disclosures. As the first stories come out about this after this requirement goes into place, I'm going to be really interested to read into the details of those and see how this actually plays out in the real world.
Yeah, I think that like there's a couple points here, and I've built products. I personally have had to help businesses respond to vulnerabilities in products, and I've also been on the other side where I was working closely with enterprises that were having to respond to incidents. 24 hours is nothing. Like it is like click your fingers and that 24 hours goes. That is not, you can't build into that 24 hours, hey, let me go learn what I have to do for CRA. Like all that needs to be done ahead of time. And so you just need to assume and be ready. So when that if and when that occur, that you are disclosed and or discover an actively exploited vulnerability, you can start, your playbook kicks in. And so this is something with your broader business. Obviously, you want to be sort of helping them get ready for it as well. Now the key is it's not every vulnerability; it's actively exploited vulnerabilities, and so it's these are the worst of the worst. And the reality is like uh, from if it's actively being exploited, enterprises are literally being attacked and compromised by definition. So again, having that rapid 24 hours, I think, is appropriate. It's not easy, and it definitely requires preparation to get ready. But ultimately, the enterprises are already subject to those attacks, and so again, this is another way for CRA to sort of push up that bar and put manufacturers on notice. They have to do better. Now, the manufacturers that are going to be most impacted by this are the ones that are shipping insecure products and aren't doing the best practices. I mean, every product out there could have a vulnerability. There is no perfectly secure solution out there. And so I think every manufacturer has to be ready for it. But those that are going to be far more impacted are those that have been skipping steps and taking shortcuts in their overall security lifecycle and security development and thus are going to be certainly more likely to experience an actively exploited vulnerability in the wild. And so that definitely is going to be impacting some manufacturers more than others for a bit. Um, I think there's certainly a corrective action there. At some point, they're going to get tired of responding to things that quickly, and they will hopefully start building better products and more secure products by default, so they don't have to respond to those in the wild. But either way, you have to be ready for it.
Yeah. We talk about the shifting of responsibility for these things, and a trend that we've been tracking that has been documented in things like the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report is that teams that are responsible for patching vulnerabilities inside of enterprises that, have these network technologies that are being exploited are losing ground due to the sheer volume of vulnerabilities that are being disclosed and the pace of patching. I think there's a combination of AI accelerated vulnerability discovery and patching, where these big vendors are using Mythos and other, you know, frontier AIs to discover vulnerabilities at a really rapid clip. They're building out and deploying patches, and then someone's got to go actually and try and install those. And when you have a whole enterprise with hundreds or thousands of these devices that are operationally critical, the business will start losing money quick if any of these things go down. Doing a major patch like that is a big undertaking. And so, on the one hand, this notification these requirements in CRA hopefully can help mitigate some of that burden that has fallen to the patching teams. But it's also possible that just given the sheer volume of increasing exploitation of vulnerabilities and then increasing disclosure of attacks and shipping of patches, that this could increase the amount of work and ultimately just the amount of bandwidth that organizations all along the supply chain, from manufacturers all the way down to the enterprises that buy the products, are just going to have to invest more in their ability to uh, keep these products secure.
To be short term, though, it's short term pain.
Yeah,
Short term pain get things more secure, so they're less likely to have, which is like the whole point of CRA, right? Um, there is one other benefit or other, I guess, implication of the Article 14 is, and it's really the reason you're all here, is it's sort of the shot across the bow from the CRA to start to pay attention and get ready. And so that is also like almost like a warm up milestone uh,
Mhm.
to the main event, which is December of 2027. So yeah, it is having the intended effect. Obviously, you're here in this webinar to learn more, but we're also getting lots of inbound questions on our side from different manufacturers to see how we can help them better protect and better get ready for CRA.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, just the beginning. As a buyer, CRA could potentially be a really good thing for you if you are sort of equipped to to take advantage of it. Your vendors are now required to send you devices with no known exploitable vulnerabilities. They're also required to provide a machine readable SBOM. And my sense, and Brian, I'm curious what your sense of it is in the wild too, is that a lot of organizations, both manufacturers and buyers, are not using SBOMs a whole lot. There may be some level where they're being exchanged, where some, companies provide them and the buyer has like a repository. They're like, yep, these are our SBOMs, but they're not really operationalized. They're not getting looked at a whole lot or used in a way that meaningfully improves their security posture in any way. And that has the potential to change now that the vendors are required to provide one. And depending on what is discovered in there, the buyer could hold the vendor accountable, or there could be, potential consequences to a vendor that doesn't do this effectively. And then we've talked about the free updates for the support period. You shouldn't have to request that as a buyer, but getting it in writing, getting in the contract that's like, hey, you're required to provide 5 years of free security updates for this product, even if it's required by the law. Get that in writing from the vendor. Still a good idea to have it in the contract. And then the declaration of conformity. So you can say like, hey, I'm buying these devices with digital elements from you. I need your declaration of conformity. I need you to send me this official document that says, yep, we are sure that this conforms to CRA. And then if it doesn't, there will be there will be fines. But what that doesn't guarantee, any of the this sort of requirements of the CRA don't really guarantee that when you unbox a device and plug it in, that what's running there, what's in there is actually secure. So it's like all the way up the chain of CRA responsibility, what these attestations and scans and checks mean is that the manufacturer and the importer and the distributor have done the required level of due diligence to say, yes, this conforms to CRA. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily secure. And there's, I think, a gap at the buyer and operator level of being able to look into these technologies at that deeper component level to be able to say like each of the chips on the motherboard, each of the DPUs in the, AI cluster, we know that that is running secure firmware, that we know where it came from and that it isn't already actively compromised and that it hasn't been modified either accidentally or maliciously somewhere along the supply chain. We know that there's not already an attacker living off the land in that device just using configurations and intentional features rather than a known exploited vulnerability. The known exploited vulnerability issue does not protect you from living off the land techniques or guarantee that those still can't be used against you. And so there is maybe a danger of knowing that a manufacturer or provider has these requirements on them of trusting a little bit too much, like, okay, that device is secure then. They had to make it secure and they attested that it conforms. And being a little less worried than you should still be about the actual security posture of the device. So I think that there's a risk of trusting too much on the basis of these regulations, uh, rather than verifying and validating for yourself that what you have is in fact secure in its current running state.
Look, the reality, like I used the word earlier, like shifting the burden. It doesn't shift the burden altogether. Like even the sort of the mere function that, hey, security updates have to occur for 5 years. I mean, that's an implication of the fact that there will be security fixes, there will be patches over time, and so the enterprise does have to keep up with the entire life cycle of the product. And so, as manufacturers make these updates available, the burden is now back to the enterprise to actually update. And so there's still an enterprise responsibility to take advantage of these things from the manufacturer and sort of build that lifecycle management into their overall program. So they have the visibility they have. They're applying the patches in a timely manner, and they're doing the right things based on what the vendors are now required to do to ultimately protect their enterprise. So there's still a very much a role for both the manufacturer to do as well as the buyer or the enterprise to do.
Yeah, 100%. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if you, as the buyer or the enterprise, got the notification or got the SBOM or installed the update. Like, if you get hacked, it's going to be a problem for you. You can lawyer up and sort out the responsibility afterwards, but you are going to suffer the burden, and it's worth shoring yourself up against that. So, as we have been talking about the specific kind of challenges or gaps, I think probably a lot of the organizations that are subject to CRA are already quite prepared on a lot of the things that they need to do. But I would guess that, the devil's in the details, and there are probably going to be some gaps that show up. And just based on our experience with what Eclipsium does for our customers and the depth of visibility into those components within devices, I would guess that the gaps that emerge are going to be in that realm, um, more so than in other realms where they find like, okay, we had the tools and we had the processes and people in place to meet a lot of these requirements, but there's just a gap in our security program that we have to go figure out how to handle in order to be able to effectively look at the level of depth that we need to really attest that our products are compliant or conformant to CRA. And then on the buyer side to validate what we have is actually secure or it's at least in the state of trust that is at an acceptable level to us. So I have this little checklist here that's just worth asking yourself either as a manufacturer or as a buyer. Have you inventoried the products with digital elements and flagged whether they are CRA in scope? As a manufacturer, that's like, okay, well, what products do you have that have digital elements that you're bringing to market in the EU in your entire, product lineup? Like what SKUs do you have that are relevant to this thing that you need to go be able to provide this SBOM and this attestation, declaration of conformity to? Do you
Yeah, and
have,
Chase, when oh,
you go
one thing
ahead.
to jump in. Uh, we throughout this, we've been talking about manufacturers or enterprises. The reality is that most of you are probably both. And I'll use Eclipsium as an example. Like we are an enterprise. Like we're buying solutions and components and other things from third parties. Like so, that is an area that we will start. And as part of the CRA piece, that there's certainly things on our side that we'll be doing to take advantage of that increased visibility and transparency that's now required by manufacturers to provide us that detail. So that's our buyer hat. But we're also a manufacturer. Like I don't ship hardware. I do absolutely produce and provide a digital asset, a solution to our customers. And so we fully expect as a manufacturer, the bar again, we've already been doing the right things, but the bar is established that the things that we have been doing we will have to continue to do, but now required by law. And so I suspect many of you, and if you reflect on it, you're really your enterprise wears both hats. You're both consuming things, buying things, but also shipping whether it's a digital asset, running a SaaS infrastructure, potentially a data center. All those provide there's burden to you as a manufacturer or a supplier to meet the CRA obligations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, making sure that you are prepared, having a contact set up for Article 14 notification process. Like that 24-hour timeline is tough under the best of circumstances. Just laying the groundwork so that the right people know who they're going to have to contact and when, and they have that contact pre-set up so that you can deliver on that. Do you have the ability to manage S-bombs at any in any position in this equation? Do you know how to request and use S-bombs as an organization? Can you fulfill a request for a machine readable S-bomb that it goes all the way down to that component level if you ship any sort of product that has those components? And I think a lot of organizations that would be a challenge. I think most of the S-bombs that are being even ones that are being delivered are mostly being like just kind of saved somewhere and not particularly used, and a lot of them don't contain the level of depth that would be required by CRA. Getting that 5-year support commitment in writing, even though it's required, it's like, yeah, get that stuff in the contract. Let your vendors know that you're going to be holding them accountable to this stuff, um, and be prepared to be held accountable for it as a vendor. Um, Assessing your stuff for substantial modification in your products that you ship. Are you customizing and modifying to the degree where you essentially become the responsible party? You become the manufacturer, even if you got, the firmware or the code or the device from an upstream manufacturer, and you're just sort of white labeling it, putting it together into a product. The threshold for substantial modification, you got to know whether you cross it or not to the point where you become the responsible party. Are you prepared to do that self-attestation or to have a third party do the self-attestation so you can deliver that declaration of conformity and be committed to it? And then are you able to verify what is actually inside, what those components are inside the device, not just at an SBOM level, but saying like an SBOM is sort of like, here's what we have intended to ship. do you have the ability to scan and verify that's what's actually in there when we ship it or when we receive it? And I think this is probably particularly relevant for like value-added resellers, ISVs, folks that receive and ship to major enterprises where they need to be both holding accountable those that they receive stuff from and also verifying like, okay, we got the declaration of conformity, but is what's in the box actually actually that? It didn't get modified or changed intentionally, maliciously, or just accidentally somewhere along the supply chain, because that happens. You know, these supply chains for this kind of technology are complicated. Are you able to verify that what you got is what you're expecting and that what you have is what you thought that you had? And I've seen many cases where it isn't, like where the confidence level within an organization about their knowledge of their technology stack was pretty had a gap between what was the reality on the ground. Whether it was, you know, there's like a policy of maintaining, okay, we keep things at least, you know, N minus two on firmware versions. We don't have anything older than N minus two. We were able to discover many devices with older firmware than that. That's just like, how are those outside of policy? Well, updating is hard, patching is hard. It's easy for things to fall out of policy. Knowing what you have is a lot harder than it seems, and is still super urgent even in the era of CRA. Okay, we're going to shift gears for just like 2 minutes and talk about DORA. DORA and CRA often come up in the same breath. They are pretty different regulations, and DORA is much more narrowly scoped. But when we have conversations about cyber regulations in the EU, DORA and CRA both come up. So we're going to talk about it for a second. DORA is specifically relevant to EU financial firms and their information and communication technology providers. So it's been applicable and is now in active enforcement since early 2025. And essentially, it means that these EU financial firms have to run an evidence of risk program where they're managing the risk of their information and communication technologies. So that's, I mean, financial services organizations, obviously a huge target for cyber attacks, and they have a lot of highly protected data that they have to manage, and they're essentially a much bigger audience for this type of regulation than other types of organizations necessarily are. So when DORA comes up, it's like this, it's very narrowly scoped, but super critical for the specific types of organizations that it applies to. CRA, way broader, more likely to have global implications, I think, because many, much like GDPR, any organization that has these products with digital elements that go to market in the EU are going to have to comply with CRA. Much like with GDPR, it's like organizations based outside of the EU, tons and tons of them. Some of the biggest ones and some of the, I mean, like, you know, Meta, Amazon, these global organizations had to put major effort into being able to comply with GDPR or change how they do business because of this. And I think similarly, global organizations are going to have to do some serious shifts in how they manufacture and deliver products in order to continue doing business in the EU or eat the fines. So yeah, DORA, EU CRA, they come up together a lot. Not the same, but yeah, DORA obligates these EU financial organizations to identify and classify every ICT asset that supports a business function and renew that classification annually. They have to maintain structured records for these assets, you know, their location, their criticality, and the interdependencies between them, and they have to do automated vuln scanning at least weekly. So these are, to some degree, similar requirements. These are more like the requirements that buyers should be doing in the time of CRA than manufacturers. But there's some overlap in the capabilities. Some of the stuff that you would have had to set up to be able to comply with DORA would also help you achieve some of the stuff that you have to do to apply with CRA. But they're fundamentally very different. They just both come up at the same time because they're both EU relevant. Okay, we're going to flip over and start talking about our favorite thing to talk about, ourselves. Eclipsium is a really great product and company, and we happen to have a lot of capabilities to help essentially everyone along the supply chain fulfill their obligations and also hold accountable their providers when it comes to both EU CRA and DORA compliance, but we're going to focus more on CRA because that's the main topic at hand. And one of the big gaps that we can fill for folks on the CRA front is that existing controls inside of a lot of organizations just can't see hardware infrastructure. And hardware is what CRA is largely about. It's that there's a lot of hardware relevance to it, and hardware devices are a huge part of what CRA is about securing. And existing security controls, existing scanning technologies just don't give you what you need to be fully compliant with it across all types of devices that exist within a typical enterprise. And Eclipsium can deliver that visibility for you. Getting down into, hardware and firmware components that exist inside of your devices, from user laptops to network and edge devices that have been in the news lately a lot because of the amount of cyber attacks that they're facing. This is a level of visibility that is required for CRA compliance and also just required for general best practices security at this point, because this is where cyber attackers are going. This orange field is what is being targeted lately. And that's because it's poorly monitored and not well understood by the sort of most established security tooling that's out there. A new thing is needed, a new approach is needed, and Eclipsium delivers on that.
Yeah, and this goes back to again the I think some comments I made very at the very beginning of this webinar around CRA, sort of really taking a broad approach to what the solution is. It's not just the software; it's the software, the hardware, and everything in between that is being delivered. Because all aspects of that can carry exposures and risk that can ultimately impact an enterprise. I don't, in my experience, I don't know of many software shops or product companies that aren't doing already a lot on their software side to detect vulnerabilities. Um, Having said that, that's usually where they stop. They usually stop on the software side. And so this, again, with the CRA obligation of, look, if you're going to ship a combined hardware software solution, you own the whole thing. You're responsible for reporting and ensuring that it's secure by design, and all aspects of that are secure by design. The software only approach is not good enough anymore. And again, that's where we can help. We can ultimately help, and we work closely with both enterprises to give them visibility to those exposures. But we also work with a lot of manufacturers. We work with manufacturers to provide a really deep visibility into the hardware, the components that they're including, to give them confidence that they're not shipping insecure products. That's a very common role for us. It all comes down to that visibility, though. You have to be able to have that deep visibility into the hardware to include all these different components that are on here that are just, quite frankly, not in scope for traditional software development and software security tools.
Yeah. Yeah. CRA really broadens the scope of what you need to be able to look at and inventory and check for security flaws. It broadens the scope beyond what most organizations already have in practice and beyond what most tools are built for. And that's the gap that Eclipsium can help solve. So uh, aligning what Eclipsium can do with the specific requirements in CRA. So SBOMs. I mean, SBOMs have been around for a long time. Many organizations can get them and can produce them, but a lot of them are not going to go down to the level of hardware and firmware components. We often talk about the hardware bill of materials, or the FBOM. We love to talk about the firmware bill of materials. Um, that's a level that you're going to need to have in many scenarios for CRA that just a lot of the existing tools are not going to be able to deliver. And Eclipsium can deliver that level that's going to be required for sort of hardware level CRA compliance. Exploitable vulnerabilities or exploited vulnerabilities. You have to, if you discover those, you have to report them, and you have to, do your best to to discover them. And Eclipsium is able to do that in hardware devices and infrastructure devices where other scanning approaches stop at that pretty shallow level. So looking into the underlying operating system to detect, OS level, firmware level vulnerabilities inside of like network devices or firewalls that have been increasingly the target of attack is something that Eclipsium can do. And then detecting active compromises. This is sort of the challenge where no matter how secure and attested a device is when you get it, that does not guarantee that it stays secure while it's operating, and it doesn't guarantee anything against cyber attackers using essentially living off the land techniques on a device. inside of your environment. And so no matter how secure the stuff is that you buy, you need to be able to monitor at this level. And that's something that Eclipsium is able to provide. And the way that we do that is through this incredible system that this company's been building for many years now for collecting deep device information, metadata about the device, firmware, memory configuration, activity logs from servers, from AI and GPU infrastructure, from user endpoints, from network devices, and even from enterprise IoT, and putting that all into our platform that will compare against a huge, 30 million plus known good images essentially of these devices and growing all the time. So we'll compare that, but also we'll decompose the actual firmware and other files that we uh, collect from these types of devices and look for behavioral signals, indicators of compromise, and essentially looking in configuration and various other sort of data points to let you know whether that device has maintained its integrity over time. You could receive it and either know or believe because of the attestation that it's in perfect shape and that it's totally secure, but that doesn't last. The landscape is constantly shifting, and anything new vulnerabilities are disclosed all the time. I thought that I was having when we were talking about that 24-hour disclosure and also the 5-year security update situation is that a lot of the time new security advisories come out that have relatively old CVEs where a vulnerability was disclosed, but it hadn't yet been known to be exploited. And that'll frequently happen where a more than 5-year-old vulnerability just starts to be exploited. And so that would hypothetically fall outside the support window, but still be something that the vendor is responsible to disclose. And I'm curious to see how cases like that will play out because new vulnerabilities are certainly not the only things being exploited, especially in the era of AI being used both for vulnerability discovery and for exploitation design. So, yeah,
especially chaining. I mean, being able to connect the dots and chain up multiple vulnerabilities to be able to achieve an outcome and an exploitation is far more common today than it was 3 years ago. And so it is going to I think, dramatically impact a lot of these vulnerabilities. Traditionally, those vulnerabilities were rarely exploited by percent. We should expect that exploitation will go up because of creative ways to chain together three vulnerabilities that normally would be considered boring, but in combination equal a successful exploit. Far more common than it was 3 years ago.
yeah, 100%. The way that people measure and respond to risk is really going to have to evolve because vulnerabilities get assigned a risk score when they come out, and exploitability or reachability is a part of that risk score. And so when a vendor discloses a vulnerability in their device, often something that they'll say is that if you have it configured appropriately, this vulnerability is not reachable from the outside. And so it's not like, you'd have to be authenticated. You'd have to already have local access to the box, and it they wouldn't be able to reach it, and so it's lower risk. But if a subsequent vulnerability comes out that allows you to gain access to that box or an authentication bypass to that box, suddenly the risk of that prior vulnerability goes up because like, oh, there's a vulnerability that you can chain. There's a authentication bypass, and now all of a sudden that vulnerability that would have required authentication before doesn't anymore because there's an auth bypass for it. But they don't go back and adjust the risk score of that priorly disclosed CVE. We've got a question here that seems relevant to the current topic, so I'm going to go ahead and throw it in. Thank you for, and yeah, audience members, please chime in. Love to hear it. Um, if Eclipsium detects exploitable vulns through binary analysis of a firmware image, how does it catch patched vulns? Most off-the-shelf scanning tools that examine binaries look for package and version because they aren't looking at the build. They're not catching that someone might have compiled in a cve.xxxx.yyy.patch file. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, behavioral signals is one way, essentially looking at, we're comparing um, against in many of these cases, a gold image from the vendor. And so if there's a patch file or if there's some sort of a file in there that is not doesn't match uh, the hash of the actual gold image from the vendor, then we'll flag that and say like there's something here that at least at the latest version, the vendor didn't say that this was going to be here. And of course, there's obfuscations that attackers can try to hide that stuff from, but we're comparing against the best known the best known image for that device and telling you, is there anything different from this than what the vendor says that there should be there? And also looking at a bunch of other sort of behavioral aspects of what's going on with the device and its own logs and stuff. So we're triangulating a lot of different signals to try to make it pretty difficult to evade detection like that. I think that would be, there's always this back and forth between attackers and defenders coming up with the ways to detect and coming up with ways to evade detection. And as the sophistication level gets higher, that gets harder and harder to do. And we're always trying to develop new techniques to make it so that that kind of a technique would not bypass detection. I don't know, Brian, you have any further thoughts about this question?
No, it's a good question. And ultimately uh, from a patching perspective, there are certainly ways to make it a little bit confusing about whether or not a vulnerability is actually vulnerable and exploitable versus not. I mean, that is where, like, at least having the SBOM sort of visibility into these solutions, I think is key. It does allow, if you're an enterprise or a manufacturer, depending on third-party components, allows you to ask those hard questions and put the supplier or the manufacturer on point to say, is this actually vulnerable? At the end of the day, if we show that a vendor X's system has the following components, and one of those components is known to be vulnerable, um, ultimately, if the vendor says they have and can attest that they are not vulnerable, um, again, there's nothing we're going to do to on at least a repeatable basis. We're not nothing we're going to do to override that vendor's statement, um, because ultimately the vendor could have mitigated that in a lot of different ways. Now, that's for sort of our traditional product. We also have some really like amazing researchers. And so we do work very closely with manufacturers to prove out whether or not something is exploitable, not exploitable. So the manufacturers don't always just have to take blind trust. And so that's ultimately where we take some of the combination of our product that we provide, as well as some of that deep research expertise that our researchers bring to bear to really sort of complement and prove out the positive or the negative and reliably do that with, again, a number of manufacturers you probably all have within your enterprise today. And so that's an area that we can help manufacturers ultimately have confidence that what they're shipping is actually secure.
Yeah. Yeah, looking deeper than package and version strength and actually doing the disassembly and decompiling gives us more more data to look at and more opportunities to detect that kind of thing. Um, Really great question. Love that. Would we've got 2 more minutes and would take another one if folks want to bring one in. But ultimately, what we're trying to help our customers do, both on the manufacturer end and on the buyer end, is trust their infrastructure. So giving that hardware inventory, we'll give you the devices and versions, but also the embedded components and the firmware inventory, and SBOMs and HBOMs and that level of knowing what you have and that what you have is what you expected to get and checks out against what the vendor is shipping and what you said you bought. Device hardening, so identifying and managing risks in your hardware infrastructure, validating the integrity of those devices. We can do automatic firmware updating on some device types, and we can tell you at least the delta between where you're at and where you should be so that you can compare against your own policies for how up to date you like to be. Examine their running configuration to let you know whether there's any risky configurations or hidden vulnerabilities in those devices, and then continuously monitor the devices that you have deployed already for firmware threats, implants, backdoors, any sort of drift that might indicate either that you've just simply fallen out of your preferred security posture, or that there has been active manipulation of the hardware in your environment for malicious purposes. So we are 1 minute from the end, and I just want to say thank you, Brian, so much for having this conversation. Really enjoyable to dig into the implications of CRA with you. Thank you to the audience for spending your time with us, and please let us know if you would like the certificate of attendance, and everybody will receive a follow-up email with a copy of the slides, a link to the recording, and we would love to have you again in our next webinar, or have you in for a meeting, give you a demo if you felt like this was interesting and relevant for your enterprise or you as a manufacturer, someone who's responsible for security. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.